So good morning. Let's start with the parsha today. Today is called a single parsha this time. It's called Emor, which means say, and it's Hashem instructing Moshe to tell Aaron, to speak to the Kohanim, Aaron and his descendants. And we have special laws for Kohanim. We once had a class on the Kohanim that the male descendants of Aaron are the ones who are going to serve in the temple. And they are forbidden from, firstly, coming in contact with the dead other than their own immediate relatives. So they're not allowed to go to funerals or cemeteries except to their own immediate relatives' funerals. It's a Jewish custom to bury the relatives of Kohanim at the edges of the cemetery in order that the Kohanim can visit their graves without having to walk into the cemetery. Then we're told that a Kohen is forbidden from marrying a woman different women who have either children from forbidden relations or have had forbidden relations, as well as a divorcee. A Kohen Gadol, a high priest, is also, in addition to is not allowed to come in contact with any relatives, any dead, even their own relatives, like a regular Kohen. And the high priest is forbidden from marrying a divorcee like a regular Kohen, as well as a widow. He can only, if he's not yet married before he becomes high priest, he can only marry someone who was never married before. Then we are told the prohibition that the animals that we use, that we bring as sacrifices, must be in perfect condition, cannot have any deformities. The same is also for the Kohanim. A Kohen who serves at the temple is not allowed to have any physical deformities, nor can they serve in the temple while they are tamei, ritually impure. Then the Torah tells us about all the different festivals. It goes through really the list of all the different festivals, starting with Passover, Shavuot. It tells us about the counting of the Omer between Passover and Shavuot. Rosh Hashanah, blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, which we mentioned actually in last week's parsha, but when we fast, Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret after Sukkot. So all those, and the mitzvah of eating at a sukkah and shaking the lulav and etrog, all that is mentioned in this week's all that's mentioned in this week's parsha, what's called the Parshat Habodot, the portion dealing with the festivals. Then Hashem gives Moshe some instructions regarding the temple. Firstly, that they should light the menorah every single day, and that every Shabbat they should place 12 loaves of showbread, which was a U-shaped bread, on the table inside of the temple. And then the Torah concludes with the story of a fellow who cursed Hashem, and they brought him to Moshe, and Moshe wasn't sure what to do with him, and Hashem told Moshe that he should be killed, and then it goes through some laws of capital punishment. So that is the parsha in short. I should also mention that tomorrow is the 14th of the month of Iyar, which is Pesach Sheni, the second Passover. I think we've done a class on Pesach Sheni, the second Passover already, where when the first time they offered the Passover sacrifice in the desert, people came to Moshe and said, we are tamei, we're ritually impure, we're not able to bring the Passover sacrifice. We're going to miss out on this great opportunity. And so Moshe turned to Hashem, and Hashem said, anyone who is tamei, ritually impure, or not there by the temple at the time, is able to offer and they missed the regular Passover sacrifice on the eve of Passover, can offer the sacrifice 1 month later on the 14th of Iyar. So that we don't offer the Passover sacrifice today because we don't have a temple, we still mark the 14th of Iyar, which Pesach Sheni, by eating some matzah. So if you have some matzah left over, you can eat matzah tomorrow. And then we're counting the Omer every day. We'll do so in a moment. And then on the 33rd day of the Omer is Lag BaOmer. It's a day of great celebration. 2 reasons have been given why. Firstly, during the time of the Omer, it's a time where we mourn the death of Rabbi Akiva's school. He had a large school, probably the largest Jewish school ever in history, 24,000 students, and they all died in plague during this period. and they stopped dying on Lag BaOmer. So therefore, Lag BaOmer became a day of celebration. Also, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the famous sages from the Mishnaic era and the author of the Zohar, the foundational book of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, he died on this day, and he asked that the day of his passing become a festive day, and so we celebrate on Lag BaOmer. And in the land of Israel, many people go up to Meron, where he's buried in northern Israel, to celebrate at his tomb. So let me open it quickly to questions. Any questions on the Parsha? All straightforward. That's great. So let's quickly do the counting of the Omer, and then we'll get to our class today, which we have a lot to cover. Fascinating story. So repeat after me. The counting, we'll be counting till now every day. The Omer, if you don't yet have the Omer app, you could download it. It sends you a reminder every evening at sundown when it's at dark to count the Omer, and also it gives you daily meditations for each day of the Omer. So we'll first say it in Hebrew. Hayom Shmona ve'esrim Yom Shehem Arba'a Shavuot LaOmer. Today is the 28th day, which is 4 weeks of the Omer. Sorry? No, it is 49 days. We're just over halfway through. The 33rd day will be on Friday. Let's get to our topic for today, which is not directly connected to the Parsha, but it's an important historical topic. Not sure we've ever addressed anything related to it, but it's a fascinating part of history that's largely misunderstood, and historians largely didn't understand it earlier modern historians. I think now it's much better understood. And that is the story of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So you may have heard before the terms Pharisees and Sadducees. These are two Jewish groups that existed in the land of Israel during the second half of the Second Temple period. So the Second Temple is destroyed around the year 70. So this is the second half of the Second Temple period. We're talking about going from about 130 BCE till about the year 70. Christians are familiar with them because they are described or mentioned in Christian religious books, the Christian Bible. They're also described in Jewish sources, where of course they're referred to by their Hebrew name, right? Pharisees and Sadducees are just anglicized or Latinized versions of the Hebrew words prushim and tzidukim. So we know about these groups, Prushim and Tzidukim, from a number of different sources besides the Christian Bible. We know firstly about these groups from Josephus. Josephus, whom we should probably do a class on. Josephus was a Jewish military leader during the war against the Romans that led to the destruction of the temple, who turned around, switched sides, and he joined the Romans mid-war, and later he wrote a book of the history of called Antiquities, about the history of the Jews. And so he's kind of one of our early historians, and he writes in his book that there were, during the Hasmonean period, which is what this period is usually referred to as, there were three sects, three groups. There were Pharisees, who believed that God controls our world. We all have free choice, as well as they believed in the afterlife. There were Sadducees, who didn't believe in God's control of our world and didn't believe in the afterlife, but did believe in choice, that people could choose their own. And then he describes a group called Essenes that didn't believe in free choice, believed everything was controlled by God and humans had no choice. We're not going to address Essenes today. There's a lot of debate about them and if they even existed, since we only know about them from Josephus. We're going to talk instead about the other two groups, the Pharisees or the Sadducees. So Josephus mentions them, but Josephus in general, although he has a lot of historical information, because he's really the only kind of book of Jewish history written as a book of Jewish history that we have from that period. And it's quite he actually has more than one book of Jewish history, and they're quite large books. But he's generally considered a very unreliable historian, and many of his claims have been shown to be false. But we know about these groups from many other sources. We firstly know about these groups from a very small book that we have from the late Second Temple period called Megillat Ta'anit. Megillat Ta'anit is one of the earliest post-biblical Hebrew or Aramaic books that we have. And in the book of Megillat Ta'anit, which is really a calendar book that goes through different dates of the calendar and different events that happened on each date, it describes many events when there were disagreements between the Prushim and the Tzedukim, Pharisees and Sadducees. And the date that the Prushim won their debate and won the argument, and therefore it became a day of celebration. So many such arguments are described over there in the book of Megillat Ta'anit. Clearly, Megillat Ta'anit is written by Prushim, describing repeatedly the celebrations when the Prushim won the debates. Our Mishnah, which is the first work of the oral tradition, as well as many collections of Braitas, which are Mishnaic era. The Mishnah was written around the year 200, and Mishnaic era Braitas are other books from that era of when the Mishnah was written. Many of them include quotes and stories of interactions between the Prushim and Tzedukim. So despite all these sources that we have, it's somewhat difficult today to reconstruct the history that happened over 2,000 years ago. And historians have various ways of understanding exactly who the Prushim and Tzedukim were. We're going to today focus on the explanations of this history, first offered by Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi, who was a late 19th century German rabbi, as well as a very prominent Jewish German historian. And he wrote a prominent book called Doros Harishonim. And this is the way he understood it. At the time when he explained Prushim and Tzedukim in the 19th century, it was outside of the consensus of what was widely regarded as the historical consensus in the early days of modern historians understand kind of a modern view of history, but he was definitely outside of the kind of norm and consensus on the subject. Over the years, historians have generally kind of turned around and come much closer to his view, and today his views, I think, are widely accepted as the norm, and kind of the way to understand that period of history. But before we get to explain exactly what the Pharisees and Sadducees, who they were, or we're going to try to use the Hebrew words, Prushim and Tzedukim, we should use the Jewish words. Let's first start by giving a little context to the story. For most of Jewish history, until this point, remember, Jewish history started over 3,300 years ago. So by the period that we're speaking about, a period of about 130 BCE, before that period, Judaism is already around for 1,200 years. It's been around for a long time. So for most of Jewish history, and this is probably also true for later parts of Jewish history, there have always been large numbers of Jews who were lapsed in their observance, or not entirely observant in Jewish law. That has always been true. Many Jews, most Jews, probably over our history, were generally observant of Jewish law. Today we live in a time where fairly rare, but for the last century or so, majority of Jews have not been observant in Jewish law, but that is a fairly new phenomenon in our history. But throughout Jewish history, most Jews were observant of Jewish law, but there has always been a significant number of Jews that were lapsed, that were not actively observant in Jewish law. This was true during the biblical period, where those lapses often included idol worship. There was always, throughout the biblical period, not always, but many times throughout the biblical period, where significant minorities of the population were involved in idol worship. Probably observed many of the commandments, but clearly were not observing the prohibitions against idol worship. Now, throughout the first 1200 years of Judaism, Jews were generally also led by a religious leadership, as well as a civil leadership. And there was generally a split between the civil leadership, the government of the land, and the religious leadership, the people who kind of made religious rulings, who also dealt with financial disputes and financial laws were all under religious kind of law, as well as family disputes and family law were generally under kind of the religious rule, but they were separate from the powers that be, the people who were actually running the land, running the community, running the country, two different kind of centers of power. And that is true, again, throughout most of our Jewish history. So there were times when the civil, and generally they got along more or less. There were disputes between the civil leadership and religious leadership. There were times in the biblical period when the civil leadership persecuted the religious leadership. In other words, the civil leaders were idolaters and were maybe anti-Judaism, and as a result, they persecuted the religious leadership. It was rare, but there were a handful of such times. Generally, though, they got along. Now, after the destruction of the first temple, Jews no longer had independence. They were at first under Babylonian rule, then they were under Persian rule. The Persians allowed Jews to return to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple and essentially have a semi-autonomous state in the land of Israel. But even in the land of Israel, they are still under Persian rule. Not long after the second temple was built, the Persian Empire is defeated by the Greeks, by Alexander, which eventually which then splits up into a number of Greek kingdoms, and the land of Israel finds itself under the kingdom of Greek Egypt, or the Ptolemies, who were the kings of Greek Egypt. Now, during this period, there's a civil government led by governors. It seems at times those governors were Jewish. Not always, but they were really responsible or answerable to the non-Jewish leadership, to the Greeks who were essentially in control. And then there was separately a religious leadership that essentially decided how the various commandments should be performed. They were responsible, among other things, not just for ritual law, but also for civil law, for family law, was all under the purview of the religious leadership. So during this period, under Greek rule, which Greek rule starts fairly early on in the Second Temple period, around 312 BCE. So it's fairly early on in the Second Temple period, and over the next 150 years or so, there's a movement towards Hellenization. Hellenization means that Jews begin to adopt Greek culture. Some Jews outright converted or left Jewish practice and began to worship Greek gods. That seems to have been less common. Most of those who were Hellenized were still, outwardly Jewish. They maybe dressed Greek, began to speak Greek as a language, adopted Greek cultural things, but they were still Jewish. Excuse me. Still observed most of the Torah, but they tended to be more lax in their Torah observance, especially in those things that perhaps were counter to Greek culture. These Hellenist Jews were a significant number, a minority, but the majority of Jews remained observant. There was, again, throughout this period, a single united religious leadership led by a Sanhedrin, a supreme council in Jerusalem, that the people generally respected and listened to. The masses, again, were largely observant. The Hellenist Jews, the Jews that had become Greek in their culture, in their outlook, and lax in practice of Judaism, were mostly the elites, the wealthy, the upper class. They were interacting a lot with Greeks. They felt themselves kind of better, and they were enjoying the kind of culture of the country that they were in, which was under Greek rule. So this really lasted until the early 2nd century BCE, when the Seleucid Greeks, which were Greeks ruling out of what today would be southern Turkey or Antioch, often referred to as Syrian Greeks, although not technically in modern-day Syria. Their capital, at least, is not in modern-day Syria. And they take control of Israel. Essentially, they're north of Israel. Egypt is south of Israel. They take control of Israel, wresting Israel from the Ptolemy Greeks. So now it's under Syrian Greek rule, and under the Seleucid rule, it's mostly the same. Where Jews have big taxes to pay and problems with the Greeks, but generally life is okay until the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. When Antiochus Epiphanes rises to power, he decides to Hellenize all his subjects, everyone under his rule. He decides he's going to forcibly Hellenize everyone. And so he embarks on a campaign in the land of Israel to ban Judaism and ban all Jewish practice, kill all religious leaders, and require all Jews, turn the temple into a Greek temple, and require all Jews to forcibly ban Torah observance and circumcision and Shabbos observance, and require all Jews to adopt Greek practices. Many Hellenist Jews who were already Hellenists joined in on the campaign, especially some extreme Hellenists seem to have been support this campaign. They were happy about it. They liked the idea of Jews assimilating entirely into Greek culture. However, there was many Jews resisted it. Many Jews were killed for it. And that led to a small band of Kohanim from a town called Modi'in, the family of the Hashmonaim, led by a fellow called Matisyahu, who led a rebellion against the Greeks. And Matisyahu, who dies during the rebellion before they see victory, and his 5 sons, they manage to defeat the Greeks and push them out of the land of Israel. They, in about 164 BCE, they go to Jerusalem, they refurbish the temple, remove all the idols, and they then, of course, cannot find any oil, and all they find is one small jug. They light the menorah, and that's the miracle we celebrate on Hanukkah. So once the Greeks left Israel, the Hashmonaim, who were from a family of high priests, whose grandfather had been high priest, Yehuda Maccabee, as he's called, the leading son of Matisyahu, and makes himself Kohen Gadol, high priest, in addition to leading the armies. He makes himself high priest, and he effectively also makes himself governor of the land. In other words, he uses his same role as high priest to also kind of lead the country. Now, for the next 20 years or so, the country is pretty unstable. It's very small. It's unstable. They're under constant threat of repeated Greek invasions and repeated Greek attempts to reclaim the land. Yehuda himself falls in battle. So do 3 of his brothers. One brother had died earlier. 3 of his brothers fall in battle. And until finally, about 20 years later, with the death of the final brother, Shimon, the leadership, the role of the high priest and leadership of the land passes on to Shimon's, the leadership of the role of the land passes on to Shimon's son, whose name is Yochanan Hyrcanus. And so Hyrcanus is Greek, Yochanan is his Hebrew name. And so at this point, now the land is somewhat secure. Greeks are no longer invading. The land is somewhat a secure country on its own. Jews are finally really independent. Now, at this time that the Hashmonaim rise to power, when they are now in control of the land of Israel, they are, of course, religious Jews. They had taken up arms in order to defend Judaism from the Greeks, in order to allow Judaism to be practiced. And so as soon as they return, although they seize civil control themselves, in other words, they take control of the country, they bring back the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council, that had been in hiding for a couple years. They bring them back. They reinstate the Sanhedrin as the leaders of the Jewish people. And however, during this time, under the reign of Yochanan Hyrcanus. The Sanhedrin, now reconstituted, realizes that a lot has changed about Jews and Judaism during the period of Greek Hellenization and Greek persecution. They found that there was, in general, large numbers of Jews were not very knowledgeable in Judaism. In other words, there had been a strong lack of education over the later years of Greek rule, particularly under Greek persecution. Many people outside of the elite, outside of the cities, particularly in the countryside, were not very knowledgeable in Judaism. Now remember, for Jews always, knowledge of Judaism, teaching Torah to our children, was one of the key commandments and always a central part of Judaism. But many Jews were not knowledgeable at the time in Judaism. There was not a good school system. It would take some time. Then they would have to reestablish essentially a school system that would take some time. Would happen a little bit later, where a later high priest would lead the establishment of a solid Jewish school system. They also discovered that many Jews were lax in particular areas. They noticed that of Jewish observance, many of kind of the general populace were lax in Jewish observance. They noticed two particular areas that they did seem to have done surveys at this time. They noticed two particular areas that a significant number of Jews, not a majority, but a significant number of Jews were laxing. The first was separating tithes. Farmers in the land of Israel must separate a number of different things from their produce, something called teruma that was given to the Kohen, the maaser, the tithe that was given to the Levi, a second maaser, a second tithe that was then brought to Jerusalem and eaten in Jerusalem. And so there were different tithes that had to be separated from one's produce. We once did a class on separating tithes a couple months ago, you may recall. And we went through kind of all the different tithes that were separated back then. So what they found is that many people were not separating the tithes properly, which meant that if you purchased food from a farmer in Israel, how do you know that they separated the tithes? A lot of them were not doing it. Even if they were saying that they would, they were not actually doing it. They also discovered that there was a general laxity in the laws of ritual purity, or in Hebrew, tumah v'tahara. So Judaism has a complex system of ritual purity, where various things can make someone tameh, ritually impure, including touching a corpse or being under the same building as a corpse, touching a dead animal, touching a dead rodent, a woman who has her menstrual cycle, a couple that have relations, and a number of other things that the Torah says if happens to a person, they become tameh, ritually impure. Once someone or something is tameh and they touch something, they touch another item, or they touch food, they can make that other item or food tameh as well. When something is tameh or someone is tameh, they are forbidden from entering the temple while tameh. They also cannot eat sacrificial meat or other holy foods while tameh. There are various, depending on how they became tameh, there are various ways to remove that ritual purity or impurity and become tahor, ritually pure, and usually through going to immersing in a mikveh and waiting until nightfall. That's usually the way to do it, but it varies. So a person who's tameh or an item that is tameh is forbidden to be brought into the temple or into the temple, and someone who is tameh is not allowed to eat sacrificial meat or certain other holy foods. Now, because this tumah status can transfer between people and items and food, so a person needs to always track their status. Are they tameh? Are they tahor? If you are tameh, you don't want to be touching someone who is tahor because you will make them tameh. You also don't want to be touching food that is going to be eaten by someone who is tahor because then you will make them tameh. You also got to be careful with all your clothing and your furniture and everything that you have in your house. You got to keep its status, keep track of its status. Is it tameh or is it tahor? And it was a very all-inclusive. There are many descriptions from the Second Temple period describing how people lived with these laws. So after the Hashmonaim had defeated the Greeks, the sages of the Sanhedrin discovered that many Jews were no longer paying attention to the laws of Tumah and Tahara. That means that anything that they touch can become Tameh. If they touch a person, they can make them Tameh. They're not even aware that they are Tameh. They touch food, they can make it tameh. They touch even an item, clothing, they can make it tameh. So because of these two problems, because there was a general laxity in separating tithes, and because of a general laxity in observance of the laws of Tumah and Tahara, the sages instituted a system called chaverus, or chaverut. It was essentially a society where you could only be a member if in this society if you were careful with all the laws, including the tithes and Tumah and Tahara. And to become a member, essentially, you would have to kind of take on a vow that you are going to be careful with the tithes and with the laws of Tumah and Tahara, and then you become a member in good standing, unless it's discovered that you're not as careful as, you're not all that careful. And only those who had taken on such a vow and had joined this Chaverus society, only they could be trusted with regard to tithes, and with regard to produce, that the tithes had been separated, and with regard to the laws of Tumah and Tahara. Everybody else was not to be trusted with regard to the laws of tithes and with regard to the laws of Tumah. The religious leadership, the students, the scholars, they were generally all chaverim. They were all part of this society. Most others, especially in the countryside, the farmers, they were not. They were referred to as amei haaretz, the masses. So this system of chaverus that was instituted again at the beginning of the Hashmonaim period, not long after, once the Greeks were defeated and the land of Israel was secure, this led to this separation between the Jewish scholarship, the Jew and religious leadership, and the common people. They could no longer eat together at a dinner. You could not eat at a dinner. Someone who was a chaver and cared for the laws of Tumah and Tahara could not eat at a dinner with the status of someone who you don't know their status. You cannot be trusted, because if they touch any of the food, they would make it tameh. So you cannot eat together at the same dinner. You cannot touch each other. Even buying things from each other, you got to be careful. It's got to go into the mikveh because you don't know if it is tahor. If you buy produce, you have to separate the tithes again, because you don't know if they did it properly. So there is now, as a result, these people, the religious leadership, the scholars essentially now have separated themselves from the general populace. And they become known as, by the general people, they are called prushim. Prushim, those that were separated. Latinized to Pharisees. So it's a name for the scholars. The scholars preferred to refer to themselves as chachamim, scholars, but the scholarly class. But they were referred to often by the people as prushim, Pharisees, the people who keep away from us. They don't want to eat with us. They don't want to socialize with us. They don't drink with us, right? They keep away from us. So, and this creates a significant social class gap between the religious scholarly class, religious leadership scholarly class, who they were the members of the Sanhedrin, they were the teachers, they were the rabbis, they were the scholars, with the rest of the people called Amei Haaretz, the people of the land. Understandably, common people resented the Prushim for not mingling with them, for not trusting them. There was a certain resentment. On the other hand, though, the common people also looked up to the Prushim, or the Chachamim, the sages. They were their spiritual guides. They were the leaders of Judaism. They were the ones that decided the halakha, that decided the law. They were the ones that taught Torah. So on the one hand, they looked up to them. They were the spiritual leaders. But on the other hand, there was a certain resentment because they kept this spiritual leadership, this scholarly class, kept away from the regular people. They were, on the one hand, their rabbis and their sages. On the other hand, they didn't mingle with them and they didn't trust them. So that is the background of the Prushim, where the Prushim came from. It was a term used to refer to the scholarly class, which was somewhat separated from the common people during the Hashmonaim period. Now, what about the Sadducees, or the Tzedukim? So, a little introduction to that as well. The Torah given to us by Moses, by Moshe Rabbeinu, has two parts to it. There was the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses that was given to us, and the oral Torah. And we once did a class on the oral Torah. We spoke about the oral Torah in detail. The written Torah, as we said, is found in the 5 books of Moses. We believe that the written Torah was written cryptically. It was never meant to be read on its own. It rather is supposed to be read within the context of the oral Torah. Now, the oral Torah is made up of 4 different parts. The first part is the oral information that Hashem taught Moses at Mount Sinai. So Hashem gave Moshe many 613 commandments, explained each one with many details to Moshe. Some of those details are found in the written Torah, much of it is not. All of that information is part of what we could call the received Torah that was received by Moshe on Mount Sinai and passed on orally over the generations to the people. In addition, the Torah itself is written in code. Hashem taught Moshe the keys to decipher that code, known as, and we have them of course today, known as the Shlosh Esrei Midot, the 13 keys to decipher the Torah. In fact, they're so important in Judaism that we recite them every day in our morning prayers. So over the years, the sages deciphered and figured out many, many laws by deciphering the code of the Torah. So this is another part of the oral Torah, the laws that were figured out by deciphering the code of the written Torah. A third part of this oral law was rabbinic law created by the Sanhedrin, by the Supreme Council of Judaism over Jewish history. By now, remember, there's been many, many years, more than 1,200 years of Jewish history. The Torah empowers the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council of Judaism, to enact their own laws, whether gzerot, fences around the Torah, in other words, extending biblical law to make it less likely for us to transgress the biblical law. So kind of creating additional prohibitions to the existing biblical law, or creating their own rules, whether to commemorate particular events like Purim and Hanukkah, rabbinically enacted festivals, or rules for the betterment of society. So the Sanhedrin have that power, and the Torah requires us to follow the rulings of the Sanhedrin, also with regard to what we call rabbinic law created by the members of the Sanhedrin. And the fourth part was customs that evolved over time. So these are really 4 different parts to the oral Torah that evolved over time. Now, in the pre-Hasmonean days of Greek rule, in the days before the Hashmonaim, under the Ptolemaic rule of the land of Israel, which again the Ptolemaic rule of the land of Israel lasted for many, many years, right? It lasted for about 130 or so years, right? So it lasted for a very, very long time. So during the Ptolemaic rule of the land of Israel, there was a long-time spiritual leader of Israel and president of the Sanhedrin by the name of Antignos Ish Sochem. He was a spiritual leader of Israel for decades. This is in the 3rd century BCE, in the 200s BCE. So now one concept that he preached and that he spoke about was the importance of following the Torah, not because you're going to get some sort of prize or reward for following Torah, not because you're afraid that if you transgress the Torah, you will get some sort of punishment, but you should follow Hashem's commandments because that is the right thing to do, because he has commanded you to do it, and if Hashem told you to do it, you should do it. Not just out of kind of desire to get rewarded or a fear of punishment. And that's an important Jewish concept that Antignos Ish Sochem stressed a lot. Now, he had 2 leading students, one by the name of Tzadok, and the other's name was Bisus. Both of them became, after hearing this from Antignos Ish Sochem, became disillusioned with Judaism. They knew that belief in reward and punishment was a principal Jewish belief. How then can we say, and it is, how then can we say that you should follow the commandments not to get rewarded, not to avoid punishment, but just because Hashem told you? And the truth is, of course, we know that both can be true. We can believe that there is reward and punishment, but not do things for the reward and punishment. But they were very troubled by this, and they both felt that the sages, the religious leadership of Israel, cannot be trusted. And therefore they both felt that we cannot rely on the oral Torah. We cannot rely on the oral tradition, going back to Moshe. We cannot rely on the ways of this, that the Torah had been deciphered using the 13 keys, because the 13 keys is part of that oral tradition. And they felt that we should not be bound to follow the rabbinic laws that the Sanhedrin had enacted over the generations. And so therefore, they still wanted to keep the Torah. So they created their own keys. The Torah is clearly written cryptically. They created their own keys to decipher the Torah using their own methods, rejecting the oral tradition and deriving their own laws, essentially creating their own versions of Judaism. Each one of them, they also rejected many of the rabbinic laws that had been given over generations. And so each one of them, both Sadok and Bisus, each one of them essentially, they had disagreements between the two of them as to the correct way to interpret the Torah. So each one essentially gathered followers to them, and disciples, and they essentially created their own independent sects, groups that observed Judaism, but a very different version of Judaism that was very different than what we would know, because they had their own interpretations of the Torah. Generally, these two versions of Judaism, that became known as the Tzidukim, the followers of Tzadok, and the Baisusim, the followers of Baisus. So generally, these two versions of Torah were mostly more lax than normative Judaism, than conventional Judaism, because they had removed the many, many rabbinic prohibitions and rules that had been made over the years. And there are countless rabbinic prohibitions that have been made over the years that really extend the prohibitions of the Torah by quite a lot. And so they removed all of those. It made you a lot more things that you could do now. So they were mostly more lax than the general Jewish community, than conventional Judaism, but not always. Sometimes the oral tradition tells us that a certain verse should not be taken at face value, and certain things are not forbidden, and they sometimes took things at face value, and therefore in some things they would be stricter than conventional Judaism. So these were both small fringe groups, and they probably would have remained small fringe groups that no one paid much attention to. However, fast forward couple decades, and following Hashmon, or maybe even close to a century, following Hashmonai victory over the Greeks, which was again in the year 164, and then about another 20 years of constant battle with the Greeks until they finally secured the land of Israel. Following real Hashmonai victory over the Greeks, the land of Israel was now led by the Hashmonai, who were religious leaders who believed strongly in the sons of Matisyahu, who had fought for and believed strongly in religious Judaism, who believed strongly in the power of the Sanhedrin, of the Supreme Council, as the final authority in all things Judaism. Now, at the time, under Greek rule, after over 150 years of Greek rule, many Jews had become Hellenist. Many Jews had adopted Greek culture, were speaking Greek as their primary language. Many Jews had as a result, were dressing like Greeks and had become lax overall in their Torah observance, these Hellenist Jews. Suddenly, now the religious people are back in power. And Greeks, their culture, their language is out. Everybody doesn't like the Greeks. The Greeks have been thrown out of Israel. So Greek culture, Greek language is now frowned upon. Hellenism is frowned upon under the new regime. So many of these Jews could not remain Hellenist. Hellenism was no longer acceptable. But they also were not hurrying to come back to traditional Judaism and reobserve traditional Judaism, which they felt had too many limitations, right? They didn't want to observe all of Judaism. And so for many of these Jews, they found somewhat of a compromise in the Tzidukim, and to a lesser extent in the Baisusim, but particularly in the Tzidukim. Many of these Jews found that the Tzidukim were a group that observed some of the commandments, many of the commandments, but their observance was much more lax than general Judaism. In some things they were stricter, but in most things they were more lax than general Judaism. There was something that they were more comfortable with. So many of these Hellenists, rather than becoming regular traditional, going back to regular traditional Judaism, needing to find another solution other than Hellenism, another way of life, they move away from Hellenism, although they largely continue speaking Greek and dressing Greek, but they now become observant Jews, but they are Tzidukim. And the way Josephus describes it, these Tzidukim were not really observant, fully observant Tzidukim either, right? In following all the Tziduki rules of observance as this kind of sect, the fringe sect of Tzidukim understood it. They were rather just looking for a lax form of Judaism. So they were not really observant of most of the Tzidukim rules. They just were able to excuse their lack of observance by saying, of much of the Torah's rules, by saying, oh, we're Tziduki, so we don't follow that. So what happens is then, as a result, there's this, as a result, in the days of Yochanan Hyrcanus, this, the first kind of son of the Hashmonaim, the second generation, when he becomes leader and the land is now, the country is now solidified and secure, the Sanhedrin is firmly the leaders, the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people. Judaism is the religion of the Jewish people. So at the same time that the sages of the Sanhedrin are trying to kind of bring back Judaism, and they also separate themselves through the Chaverus society, and becoming essentially Prushim. While this is happening, many of these Hellenist Jews, who are mostly the elite, the wealthy, the elite, the well-educated, many of these, especially dwelling in the big cities, in Jerusalem in particular, many of these Hellenist Jews now become Tzidukim. And suddenly the Tzidukim is not just a fringe sect anymore, but it becomes a sect that is widely accepted as kind of the version of Judaism of much of the elite. So during this time, on the Yochanan Hyrcanus, which is about 130 to 100 BCE, there's this distancing, there's this bringing back Judaism to the land of Israel, essentially bringing religious Judaism back to power. But there's also, at this time, a separation of the religious leadership, the scholarly class, from the masses, generating what becomes known as, the scholarly class becomes known as the Prushim, or Pharisees. And at the same time, the former Hellenists, who were looking for another option, largely become Tzidukim, become Sadducees, and now much of the Jewish elite, the wealthy Jewish elite that were formerly Hellenists, are now Sadducees, are now Tzidukim. This sect is no longer a fringe sect, but a sect that represents a minority, a small minority, but a significant minority, and who are the elite of the people and who control much of the country's wealth. So Yochanan Hyrcanus serves as both high priest and he's king. And at first he, again, is a big supporter of religious leadership. His father and uncles had fought for Judaism in the land of Israel to allow Jewish practice. But he has great respect for religious leadership and the Sanhedrin. But he also does not want to reject the elite. After all, they are the ones that run much of the country. And so he embraces them and he hires them for different important jobs and has some of them as advisors in his civil leadership. And so much of the civil leaders, and they probably were the people who had the financial means and the expertise to be able to perform many of the jobs. And so the Tzidukim, these former Hellenists, now Tzidukim, hold many important roles within Yochanan's government, within Yochanan, who is the leader within his government. He also begins to take steps that are maybe not in line with Jewish law. One particular thing that he does as the land of Israel becomes secure, he starts going on wars of conquest, which itself is something that Judaism frowns upon. He conquers the country to the south of Israel, the Edom, or the Idumeans, and he decides to forcibly convert them to Judaism. Similar policy to what the Greeks had. Now, the Sanhedrin are really upset about this because Judaism does not proselytize, and we certainly do not forcibly convert somebody. In fact, if someone does not willingly accept to follow all the commandments, the conversion is invalid. And so as far as the Sanhedrin was concerned, all those Idumeans that he had converted, that he had forcibly converted to Judaism, are all not Jewish. Their conversions were all invalid. So here, there's already a rift between Yochanan Hyrcanus and the Sanhedrin. And he's a leader for a very long time, for 31 years. Towards the very end of his reign, he's increasingly at odds with the sages due to his extensive wars and his policy of forcibly converting people, all of which is not accepted. And he's, of course, upset that the sages won't celebrate his victories in battle and won't accept his converts as legitimate converts. And so the final rift comes when, towards the end of his life, one of the sages has the audacity to go over to him and ask him to step down from his position as Kohen Gadol, as high priest, because he had heard a rumor that Yochanan's mother had been someone forbidden for a Kohen to marry, and therefore Yochanan was not a legitimate Kohen. That rumor, turns out, was not true. And there was no validity to it. However, and the other sages immediately rejected that and rejected the call of this particular sage. However, that was enough to set Yochanan Hyrcanus off. He is already at some friction now with the leaders of the Sanhedrin, and he decides, after many years of being very righteous and restoring religious life to Israel and the religious leadership to Israel, after many years, he decides he's had enough with the Sanhedrin, and he decides to become a Tzidduki. He decides he's going to become a Sadducee himself. And so at the very end of his life, he becomes a Sadducee, and now the man whose father and uncles and grandfather had fought the Greeks and fought Hellenist influence now joins the group that is mostly made up of former Jewish Hellenists who were lax in Torah observance, and still 30 years after the Greeks are once and for all gone from Israel, and 50 years after the Hanukkah miracle, are still culturally very Greek, still speaking Greek with Greek names and dressing like Greeks, although they have now dropped all Greek religious stuff and are now Sadducee, most of them. He now joins them. He now joins their group at the very end of his life. In fact, our sages take from Yochanan a lesson that someone can be good their entire life and very righteous, and he was. And then at the end of their life, as an old man, they can switch sides and move away from Judaism and from observance. So now the Tziddukim go from being 100 years ago, when they were started, a very small fringe religious sect, to becoming a large elite of mostly lax in observance group that now controls Israel. Not only are many of them working in the government, but the leader himself, Yochanan Hyrcanus, he himself has now become a Tzidduki, a Sadducee. After the death of Yochanan, his son Aristobulus becomes leader for a short time. He's a pretty horrible leader. He even declares himself king, but he dies after a year or so of leadership. He dies very quickly. And then his brother, another son of Yochanan Hyrcanus, whose name is Alexander Yanai, becomes king. Alexander Yanai. Now, Alexander Yanai was raised as an observant Jew, but since his father's court, or his father's reign, was mostly surrounded by Hellenists, or many of the kind of people working in the government were Hellenists, were Tzidukim, Sadducees, former Hellenists. Alexander Yanai had been raised as an observant Jew, grandson of the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, that had fought a religious war to free Israel, and yet he had been raised with Sadducees, Greek-speaking, that is, Sadducees all around him, who were mostly lax in observance and rejected the leadership of the Sanhedrin, of the Supreme Council of Judaism. And so while he himself was an observant Jew, he had an affinity for the Tzidukim. He had been raised with them. They were all around him. He knew them well. Yet he remains faithful to Judaism thanks to the influence of his wife, Shalom Tzion. And so his wife was a very righteous woman, Shalom Tzion. She was the sister of Shimon ben Shattach, who was the leader of the Sanhedrin, of the Supreme Council. So her brother was essentially the number two. There's the president of the Sanhedrin, and then there's the leader. He was the number two religious leader of Israel at the time. And so she was both related to the leadership as well as she was very religious. And so under her influence, he restores the at least religious power back to the Sanhedrin, recognizes the Sanhedrin as the official religious authority of Israel. The temple reverts back to observing the service in the traditional Jewish way, from the Sadducee way, and they continue to, and so now essentially Judaism, Israel has gone back to traditional Judaism, led by Alexander Yanai under the guidance of the Sanhedrin, of the religious leadership, who were the Prushim, who were called Prushim, the Pharisees. Now, at one point during his reign, Alexander Yanai, who again always had a close relationship with the Tzidukim and always had an affinity for them, he has a change of heart. And he decides that he doesn't want to deal with the Sanhedrin anymore, the Supreme Council of Judaism, the religious leadership. He doesn't want to be answerable to them. The Sadducees have no Sanhedrin, have no kind of Supreme Council. It's not clear exactly what their religious leadership consisted of, but probably a couple of different teachers. But it wasn't. They didn't have a kind of clear council with absolute power, religious authority, that is. And so he decided he had enough of the Sanhedrin, and he decided it's time. He wanted to become a Tziduki. Now he knew that wouldn't go over well because most Jews were observant, were largely observant in Judaism, even if they were lax in some things. And most Jews respected the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council, as the final authority of Judaism, and would not want Alexander Yanai, who's now king of Israel, to be the to become a Tziduki, a Sadducee. So he decides to become a Tziduki in a very strange way. One of the biggest celebrations every year in the temple was the Nisuch Hamayim, the pouring of the water on Sukkot. Sukkot is one of the three festivals of pilgrimage where Jews from all over the land of Israel come to the temple and for the festival. And every night of Sukkot they would celebrate all night with dancing and juggling and big fires. They would celebrate all night in the temple, and in the morning there was a special ceremony where they would pour water into a bowl on top of the altar. And so Alexander Yanai goes up to pour the bowl. Now the Tzidukim, since this ritual of pouring the water is not mentioned in the written Torah, it's from our oral tradition, the Tzidukim did not believe in it. Alexander Yanai gets up on top of the altar in front of probably tens of thousands of Jews who are there for the celebration, and he's to pour the water into the bowl, and he raises up his hand and he pours the water on his feet in violation and breaking the rules of how it's supposed to be done. The people immediately recognize what he is doing. He is refusing to carry out the ritual as commanded, as it's supposed to be done. He must be a Sadducee, a Tziduki, and they immediately attack him with what they have in their hands. It's Sukkot. What do you have in your hands on Sukkot? They're all holding etrogs. And so they all throw their etrogs at him and they pelt him with etrogs. Now, he was expecting this. He had planned for this, and he had placed mercenaries, mostly Idumeans that were made up most of his army. He placed mercenaries strategically all around the temple courtyard. And so as soon as people started pelting him, these mercenaries started attacking the people, leading to a battle in the temple courtyard itself, which continued for days all around the streets of Jerusalem, and really turned into a civil war between the masses, who were horrified that their leader had kind of so publicly rejected traditional Judaism, and the Yanai's mercenaries, and so there's a civil war where King Alexander Yanai's mercenaries gained the upper hand. They were the soldiers. They gained the upper hand. The Jewish leadership, as a result of this, are forced into exile. They're forced to go into hiding or into exile. They're not able to, because he's going to kill them, because he's now gone on an all-out war against traditional Judaism, and the service in the temple itself moves away from the traditional way and follows the Tziduki interpretation. There were, however, constant battles over the coming years, the final years of Yanai's reign, between people who generally rejected Tziduki rule and the king's army. There were constant ongoing battles, the people never accepting Yanai's switch to becoming a Tziduki. Yanai dies as a young man. He's not king for very long. And when he dies, his wife, Shlomit Alexandra, becomes queen. As queen, she's a righteous woman. She restores the Sanhedrin. The religious leadership comes out of hiding, removes Tzidukim from power entirely, and puts traditional Jews in roles of power. And as a result, the Prushim, the Pharisees, are once again in control of the land, with a queen who is favorable towards them and is the sister of the deputy leader of the Sanhedrin, Shimon ben Shattach. What happens to the Tzidukim and the Prushim? So when Shlomit Alexandra dies, her two sons fight a civil war. Her two sons, one was called Aristobulus, one was Hyrcanus. They fight a civil war over the kingdom of who should be king next. Eventually, both of them turn to the Romans, who had by now captured the Syrian-Greek kingdom and captured all of Syria. And they turned to the Romans, and they asked the Romans they each turned to the Romans and asked the Romans to help them against the other side. The Romans respond and promptly march on Jerusalem, capture Jerusalem, both sides letting them in, hoping that the Romans are going to side with them. And the Romans, there are then continuous battles, even under Roman rule, between these two brothers. And eventually the Romans install a Idumean, a non-Jew, a son of an Idumean who had converted to Judaism, again in violation of Jewish law and therefore not considered Jewish by traditional Jews. By the name of Herod, they install him as a puppet king in the land of Israel. Herod is not Pharisee, he's not traditional Jew, he's not Tziduki, he's not observant at all. He considers himself Jewish because his father was forcibly converted and he thinks he's Jewish, and is very offended by anyone who suggests that he's not Jewish. He definitely considers himself Jewish, but he's certainly not observant of Jewish law. He's technically not Jewish. He dislikes the Prushim, and they dislike him. He kills many of the religious leaders who don't follow what he instructs them to do, and he dislikes the Tzidukim, the Sadducees. Instead, he installs Greeks, Romans, or fellow Idumeans to positions of power. He doesn't like any of them. The Tzidukim and the Prushim continue throughout this period to fight over control. So now there's no battle anymore for control of the country, because the country is now under Roman control, or under Herod's control. Nobody controls the country, not the Pharisees, not the religious leadership, not the Sanhedrin, not the Sadducees, not the Tzidukim. Nobody controls the country now. It's the Romans under their puppet leader, Herod. They do continue fighting for control of the temple, and who basically fight, but they more fight by bribing the Romans to allow them to take over the temple, and each side keeps trying to bribe the Romans by offering them more money to let them take over. And the Romans, of course, are happy to take everybody's money. After Herod's death, Israel then falls under renewed Roman rules, and now Jews are really struggling under Roman persecution. Life under direct Roman rule is horrible for the land of Israel. Eventually, it leads to a war and rebellion against the Romans. The second temple is destroyed around the year 70. about 235 years after the Hanukkah story, and about 200 years after the rise of the Tziddukim during the days of Yochanan Hyrcanus, and the rise of the Prushim, or when the Chachamim, when the sages became known as Prushim. Following the destruction of the temple, Jews already had no longer any political power to fight over. Who's going to control the country? Religious Judaism had no power already for some time. Jews chose to observe the Torah or chose not to observe the Torah. There was no one could force anyone to do anything. And the leadership of the land certainly was not going to listen to religious leadership. They were Romans. The battles over who controls the temple were also no longer relevant now that the temple was destroyed. So the Tziddukim, who generally had not been all that observant, were generally lax in Judaism, they just disappeared. We never hear about them again. They likely assimilated with the Romans and Greeks. Most Tziddukim spoke Greek as their primary language, unlike most traditional Jews who spoke, and the vast majority of Jews who spoke Aramaic. And so they were more comfortable in many ways with Greeks, and they assimilated among the non-Jewish Greeks living in the land of Israel. That's what likely happened to them. In addition, with the temple no longer standing, the laws of Tumah and Tahara, ritual purity, are no longer as relevant, because they're mostly relevant as to for entering the temple or eating sacrificial meat. There's no sacrificial meat, there's no entering the temple, and so the laws of ritual purity are no longer relevant. Eventually, over the coming years, Jews would be thrown off the land. The Jewish farmers all across the land would be thrown off the land. There's no more Jewish farmers in Israel, and that would lead to the end of a need to keep the laws of Tumah and Tahara for certain produce that was holy and that had to be eaten b'tahara, with purity. It also brought an end to the need to separate tithes. Without Jewish farmers, there's no tithes being separated. As a result, that leads to the end of the Chaverus society, of the scholars who would join this society that kept them separate from everybody else. So the Chaverus society ceases to function. The religious leadership are no longer Prushim, they're no longer Pharisees, they're no longer separated from the masses. So that is the story of the Prushim and the Tziddukim, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, during these kind of last 200 years of the Jewish leadership of the Second Temple, and how each one became what they became and what happened to them. There's a lot of lessons from this period, but I think when talking about the Tziddukim and Prushim, there's two very important lessons that come to mind. The first is the Tziddukim, right? They started off as kind of this sect that created changes to Judaism. It was at a time when there were many sects arising, particularly during the days of Yochanan Hyrcanus, following the end of Greek rule. Many different Jewish groups that were not happy with the Sanhedrin or thought the Sanhedrin was corrupt separated, and there were many different sects among the Jewish people, including probably the earliest forerunners of the Christians, probably started around then. And so there were what seemed to be different changes to Judaism. Many Jews were adopting Tzidduki forms of Judaism because they thought it was more convenient, it was better, it was easier. And sometimes changes to Judaism may seem good at the time. Sometimes they succeed over the short term, but they never succeed over the long term. Over the years, there have been dozens of breakaway groups from normative conventional Judaism. There have been many groups that have kind of broken away and created their own. None of them has survived, at least as Jews, over the long term. Some went on to create their own religion, like Christians or some other small breakoffs of Judaism that became small religions. Most of them just eventually disappeared from the face of history. All those groups, while traditional conventional Judaism, remains and is still here today. The other thing is that the Prushim, a big part of the struggle during that late Second Temple period, was due to this separation between the scholarly class and the regular people. It was done for halachic reasons, because of the laws of ritual purity that needed to be observed, and most people did not observe them. It was only later that they actually started focusing on Jewish education, which would actually resolve the problem of people not observing various laws. But it's important for religious leadership to be close to the people, to be invested with the people. And separating the people from the religious leaders and the scholars leads to friction and eventually to a lack of trust in those leaders. So it's important that leaders take an interest in the community, and the way to counter assimilation or counter these breakaway groups is to be for the scholars, the religious leaders, to respond to everyone's personal religious needs, be aware of their congregation, and be involved in the needs of every individual rather than separating from them. We have not needed to since the destruction of the temple, and thankfully Judaism continues to live and continues to thrive. So that is the story of the Siddukim and Prushim, Pharisees and Sadducees. And hopefully you know a little bit more about it. I didn't mention, I probably should mention, that we also know about them from Christian sources. Christians who were another breakaway, or at least probably built off from a couple breakaway sects of Judaism, definitely did not like the Pharisees, right? The traditional Jewish leadership. And so therefore the Christian Bible has a lot of bad things to say about the Pharisees, understandably. So we thank again Carmi for sponsoring our breakfast. He's not here anymore. And we will be back, God willing, next week, where we will talk about the evolution of Jewish customs and how Jewish customs evolve. Just one event coming up this week, this coming Tuesday night, we have an organization called the Jewish Law Forum, which explores, we have a symposium where we explore different facets of dinner, where with a symposium we explore different fascinating subjects, and we look at the civil law. We have lawyers and experts in civil law, as well as the Jewish perspective on various subjects. So we're going to have such an event this Tuesday night. It's going to be a full dinner, sit-down dinner, with a symposium where we will be discussing the question of donor rights. If someone wants to donate, give a donation, can you put your name on the thing that you are donating? We know that lots of synagogues and Jewish communities do that. Can you? What is the sources for that? If you do, can the community later decide to take it off? If they